Hi, I'm Leah Louise from Inspired Quilting by Leah Louise. Thanks for joining me. I'm glad you're here today. We're talking about fat quarter quilts. I did this quilt a few weeks ago, and I've got it finished. It's a fat quarter pattern, which I will go ahead and attach down in the description. But what I want to show you is the quilt behind me over here is the same pattern. And it looks completely different in different fabrics. So it's kind of fun to use your fat quarters and use different collections, different groups, different fabric styles, colors, patterns, and mix it up with just the same quilt pattern, and it's going to look completely different. So with that in mind, I wanted to keep that theme with my quilt back. And what I've done is I pulled the fat quarters together that I had that I can use, and I used 10-inch squares. And by cutting 10-inch squares, this is a baby quilt, and it measures 36 by about 42. So I needed 4 10-inch squares wide and 5 10-inch squares long. So I cut those up, and I pieced my backing, and I've got it all ready to go, and I sandwiched my quilt, and I've got it basted. And look at this. I even had a machine quilt diagram. Let's see, can we get that on there so you can see it? Turn it just right. So I was going to kind of go with this swirly pattern, but you know, I've nicknamed this quilt my desperate measure quilt because it seems every step of the way some little thing or another created an obstacle. And an obstacle is simply a challenge to overcome. And being quilters and creators, we are creative. And we get past that, and sometimes we learn new techniques and new skills, and other times we just sit back and laugh and are thankful we got through it. So when I went to sit down at my sewing machine, my lovely Viking Husqvarna, who just celebrated her 19th birthday, the little display screen didn't want to light up. So it's hard to set the free motion quilting tensions and settings without the screen. And there's a lot of things I can do from memory just because I know where the buttons are. But sometimes it works, and today was a day it wasn't going to work. So I said, okay then, we are going to move on to the next step, and that's straight line quilting. So get my trusty walking foot, and we are on a roll. And a walking foot, if you haven't used it before for quilting, is fantastic. It carries all the fabrics together nicely. It sews a great straight line. And just set your stitch a little longer, get a nice sharp needle, and go. And so that's what I did. I had a great pattern working, and I did some straight line quilting, and it went really quick. And that's what I'm going to show you some ideas about that. The other thing, of course, that when we get to the binding, is I had a single fat quarter. Now, a fat quarter can generally do a baby quilt okay for binding, but it can be a bit tight. And in this case, because it was a little bit longer, the quilt itself, that I needed an extra length than what I could normally get out of a fat quarter. So instead of cutting my binding at 2.5, I cut it at 2.25, and it worked out great. So again, we just need to sometimes be a little flexible and work with what we have and make it all come together beautifully. And it did, and I'm very, very happy with that. So let me show you how this this quilt has evolved and where we've come to, and how we're going to finish it off and celebrate. And I still have a second one to complete, but that's okay. I've got this down. I'm way more than halfway there, and it should be finished within the next day or so. So watch along. I'm anxious to show you this finished quilt. Thanks for being here. I've been homesick all week, and I want to get into some quilting. And these are 2 small baby quilts that I can get finished very quickly. The only thing I need to do is create the back. Now originally this was the front, and I started putting scraps together for the back, but it almost became a front in itself. So I'm going to go ahead and make 2 quilts out of these. And I'm using fat quarters. I'm just using everything I have on hand. Don't want to have to go get anything. So I found these fat quarters here that are going to work out okay. I'm going to make 10-inch squares, put big blocks together for the backing, and then just quilt from there. These quilts are very similar in size. What I'm going to do is make one long piece of the backing, because one of these is a little longer than the other. And I'll size the backing to the larger one, and then the other piece should fit for the shorter one. It's only by about 3 or 4 inches that it's different. So let me go ahead and show you how I'm going to do this. From each of the fat quarters that I had selected, I cut two 10-inch squares, and I put them together in order to create the backing for these two quilts. Now, I had enough. I just made one long strip. I only needed 4 wide, and I needed about 4.5 long, so I made it doubly long. I've quilted this, cut it off, and now I have a piece ready for the next one. For me, this is all about getting these two quilts quilted. I haven't done some quilting, finishing quilting in a while. I've been so busy making quilt tops that I really need to get myself back on track, and this is sort of that motivation that I needed. But what I want to show you, I'm going to turn this over on the other side to show you some of the quilting tips that I want to share with you. But I did want you to see just how this background works, or I should say this quilt backing works. Just taking large 10-inch squares and sewing them together. They all sort of have a common color theme, and it ties relatively well. And it, again, we're dealing with that purple, and I sound like, you know, it's a bad thing, but it's just not a color I'm used to. And you know, but bringing in other colors with it, it's bright, and it's just kind of a fun, eclectic collection of fabrics. So let me turn this over. I don't want to do it under the camera while we're filming, because the focus gets all out of whack with all these batiks. So give me just a moment. I actually raised this up a little higher so the stitching is closer to the camera and you can see better. There is nothing fancy about this. This is just straight stitching. I got my walking foot out, which is fabulous for straight stitching. It actually can do large curves as well, but it's wonderful because it'll pull the bottom fabric along with the batting and the top and the basting. It all holds together really well, and I don't have any problems with tucks or wrinkles or anything getting in the way. So if you're going to do just some basic straight stitching, I recommend always use the walking foot. That and a nice new needle, because a sharp needle is going to make a huge difference. Now, the way I decided how I'm going to do this, I mean, a lot of times you can just, you know, stitch in the ditch. I don't stitch in the ditch because my lines aren't that straight. And whenever I try and actually get in there, my line is wavy and goes all over the place. So I don't fuss with that. I will do the 1/4 inch on either side of the seam. But what I started here is, this was my first, is I put this seam in along the border because I like to keep my borders in place. I've got some threads here. Keep my borders in place while I'm quilting, and so I kind of get that set first, especially the accent strip because it's narrow. I don't want it wavy, so I set it nice and straight, sew that down, and then I came over here. I actually did this one first about 1 inch in, and that kind of became my guide of what I was going to do. And my goal was to do a single line of quilting and then also have the 3 lines. And it just sort of makes a nice repeating pattern. It adds a little symmetry to it and some interest, but it's not difficult at all. What I did first was put these major single lines in. Now, I was going to measure them so I was consistent, but I didn't have my little ruler and I couldn't find it in a hurry. So I grabbed this quilt block, and you'll see, well, it kind of worked. You'll see from here to here that I use this, where are some single lines, to space my single lines apart. So, you know, you don't have to get technical and measure certain dimensions and, oh, is it going to be even when I get to the other side, and all those kinds of details. What's important is that you get it quilted and you get it finished. There's so many details. My credo is don't sweat the small stuff because it really doesn't matter. Now, as you're sewing, initially when you're going along a seam, it's a bit easier to keep your seam, your stitching line straight because you're foot, your presser foot, can follow right along in line with this. And if you watch where your presser foot is going, not your needle, watch your presser foot, you're going to get a much straighter line. If you're trying to guide your needle, you're going to be more apt to move things because it's hard to follow. Your presser foot gives you a good visual. It's a larger piece that you can keep your eye on, and you just keep it straight. Now, you notice these are not perfect. I used a variegated pink thread that I really like because I thought it'd be a great contrast. And I know that I'm not perfect, and that's okay. I don't expect to be, and I certainly don't, tell people that I am by any means, but I enjoy doing it. And for me, I want to get this finished. So I got my 2 straight lines in, and then I put a line down the center. And that's sort of my guideline. Then I use my presser foot and go on either side. Well, this side's a little narrower than that side, but that's okay. It all works together. And then I move over and I do the same thing here. Now, one thing I want to show you, I'm looking for an example, and I'm not seeing it necessarily. Okay, right here. See where there's a little curve right there? I didn't really get nice and straight at this point. If you're sewing along and you make a small jog like that, don't try and fix it immediately because then you're going to have a divot. Just slowly and gently work your way out of it and come back, and it's going to be less obvious. I'm trying to see, I know there were a couple other spots. Yes, so here's me trying to stitch in the ditch. This just happened to fall that between these lines, the sewing was right here on the edge. So I bumped it over just a little bit so it's outside the ditch. Because for me, I think sewing in the ditch, while the theory is that it's very easy and forgiving, it shows every misstitch you take. Every time you jog a little one way or the other, you have, and especially where I have such a contrast in color, it would be incredibly obvious. So for me, just go along the edges. Don't even worry about getting into those seam lines, and then it creates just a nice little pattern across the top. So now what I'm going to do, I'm just trying to let you see through this without the camera going crazy on me. Here's some places where it got narrow, where it got wide. I just want to show you that it all works. It works really well, and quite honestly, when the quilt is laying down, very seldom is it going to be perfectly flat and perfectly square that someone can say, oh, look, that doesn't line up. No one's looking at that. They're going, oh, look at that really cool fabric. That's fun. Oh, you did a great job. I like this. This is pretty. And that's great. That's what we want, is people to enjoy it. We want people to kind of grab it in their hands and know that it's going to endure and hang on and last for a lifetime. So get your quilting done. Don't be afraid of it. Use a walking foot. Use a sharp needle. And just go with it and have fun. There's so much you can do. And I think this came out great. I'm going to go ahead and get the binding on it, and then I'll do a final photo of this. So I hope you're getting inspired to get some quilting done. I know I have a lot more quilt tops I need to work on. So let's get this done together. And here's a peek of what the quilt back looks like. The 10-inch squares work really well. So each fat quarter will yield 2 10-inch squares, and pair them up across the back, and you've got a great quilt backing. It goes together very easily, and it looks nice. It almost becomes a reversible quilt. So this is a fun way to finish your quilt. Let me show you one last picture here. And here's our finished fat quarter baby quilt, bound and quilted. It looks great. I hope you have a chance to make your own.